Friedrich Nietzsche on the Genealogy of Morals, Part 1, Section 6. To this rule, that a concept denoting political superiority always resolves itself into a concept denoting superiority of soul, it is not necessarily an exception, although it provides occasions for exceptions, when the highest caste is at the same time the priestly caste, and therefore emphasizes in its total description of itself a predicate that calls to mind its priestly function. It is then, for example, that pure and impure confront one another for the first time as designations of station. And here, too, there evolves a good and a bad, in a sense no longer referring to station. One should be warned, moreover, against taking these concepts, pure and impure, too ponderously or broadly, not to say symbolically. All the concepts of ancient man were rather, at first, incredibly uncouth, coarse, external, narrow, straightforward, and altogether unsymbolical in meaning to a degree that we can scarcely conceive. The pure one is from the beginning merely a man who washes himself, who forbids himself certain foods that produce skin ailments, who does not sleep with the dirty women of the lower strata, who has an aversion to blood. No more, hardly more. On the other hand, to be sure, it is clear from the whole nature of an essentially priestly aristocracy why antithetical valuations could, in precisely this instance, soon become dangerously deepened, sharpened, and internalized. And indeed, they finally tore chasms between man and man that a very Achilles of a free spirit would not venture to leap without a shudder. There is, from the first, something unhealthy in such priestly aristocracies, and in the habits ruling in them which turn them away from action and alternate between brooding and emotional explosions. Habits which seem to have as their almost invariable consequence that intestinal morbidity and neurasthenia which has afflicted priests at all times. But as to that which they themselves devised as a remedy for this morbidity, must one not assert that it has ultimately proved itself 100 times more dangerous in its effects than the sickness it was supposed to cure? Mankind itself is still ill with the effects of this priestly naivete in medicine. Think, for example, of certain forms of diet, abstinence from meat, of fasting, of sexual continence, of flight into the wilderness, the Ware-Mitchell isolation cure, without, to be sure, the subsequent fattening and overfeeding, which constitute the most effective remedy for the hysteria induced by the ascetic ideal. Add to these the entire anti-sensualistic metaphysic of the priests that makes men indolent and over-refined, their auto-hypnosis in the manner of fakirs and Brahmins, Brahma used in the shape of a glass knob and a fixed idea. And finally, the only too comprehensible satiety with all this, together with the radical cure for it, nothingness, or God. The desire for a unio mystica with God is the desire of the Buddhist for nothingness, nirvana, and no more. For with the priests, everything becomes more dangerous. Not only cures and remedies, but also arrogance, revenge, acuteness, profligacy, love, lust to rule, virtue, disease. But it is only fair to add that it was on the soil of this essentially dangerous form of human existence, the priestly form, that man first became an interesting animal. That only here did the human soul in a higher sense acquire depth and become evil. And these are the two basic respects in which man has hitherto been superior to other beasts. Okay, so this for me is really the moment when the book really begins to take off. He introduces this theme of the priestly aristocracy. And I have quite a few questions about it that I don't think Nietzsche really has specific answers for. But it's interesting that there seems to be, almost from the beginning, this sort of division within the ruling class, that there is some portion of itself, the priests, that in some instances become influential enough to literally become the ruling class itself. And you end up with a sort of king-priest combination, a ruler who is also a kind of administrator of spirituality to the common people. And he notes that the same pattern that he had isolated in the previous section, where the ruling class tends to identify itself with some particular character trait, blonde hair, light skin, the habit of always being truthful and honest, that sort of thing. Terms of self-praise that eventually become more or less synonymous with good. The priestly class introduces this new variant of pure. The priestly class is the one, they are the ones who are pure, and their purity initially, Nietzsche notes, is completely unsymbolic. Again, it doesn't really have what we moderns would identify as a moral or spiritual meaning. It just simply refers to these particular material practices of keeping oneself clean and avoiding certain impurifying practices. But he notes also that there is, from the beginning, a tendency for the priests to take this concept of purity and internalize it and turn it into something dangerous. He seems to feel that while he does recognize that the priestly class is an almost universal form within human civilizations, he seems to think that there's something about it that's inherently unhealthy, that the priests are sort of diseased from the beginning, and that even though they present themselves as the bearers of a remedy, their remedy turns out to be way more dangerous than whatever it was they were trying to cure. And he specifically, I love that he the one specific name that he mentions here is S. Weir Mitchell. He was sort of a 19th century pioneer of what we would now call the wellness industry, not to be confused with the healthcare industry. He was a kind of physician, but what he really did was sort of, I think, commodify ways to make primarily bourgeois people feel better about themselves. In particular, he's known for pioneering this rest isolation cure that Nietzsche refers to. It was mostly practiced upon women who were showing signs of what was then referred to as hysteria. Nietzsche also uses that term, hysteria induced by the ascetic ideal. Initially, hysteria, of course, was thought to be an exclusively female disorder. In fact, the word actually derives from the Greek term for womb or uterus. It was thought literally to be a disorder of the uterus. But by the 19th century, people had started to begin to figure out that, for one, it wasn't an exclusively female disorder, and also had nothing really to do with, the reproductive apparatus. Hysterics were not suffering from a bad womb, they were suffering from bad thoughts. And it was Freud, more than anybody else, I think, that really took the concept of hysteria and, I don't want to say demedicalized it, but showed that it wasn't a somatic disorder, that it was something that had to be dealt with at the level of ideas and thoughts and language and so forth. But what was interesting, Weir Mitchell probably today is most famous as a footnote to Charlotte Perkins Gilman's classic short story, The Yellow Wallpaper, which tells the story of a woman submitted, apparently by her husband, to this rest cure, which involved basically isolating the patient, minimizing their available stimuli, basically putting them in a room off by themselves, keeping things very quiet, keeping them in bed most of the time so that they don't move their muscles, and administering things like massage to them so that you can sort of stimulate their muscles and so forth without having them spend any energy or do any work. And of course, in Gilman's story, the woman submitted to this treatment goes insane. By the end, she's very much a victim of this dreadful treatment. But I think it's interesting that Nietzsche should bring up this treatment as his example, his one specific example of the ethos of the priestly class, because it's a modern example for one, and nobody, I think, prior to this had ever referred to S. Ware Mitchell as a priest. But I think in Nietzsche's conception, we can see that wellness industry is still basically fulfilling much the same function. And in fact, what Nietzsche refers to as the priestly aristocracy here, I think we still have it. We still very much have it, even though the priests, the official priests, the religious ministers and pastors and so forth, constitute only a small segment of it. And I think more than anything, maybe the best designation for it would simply be what modern Marxists refer to as the professional managerial class, who in the late 20th century began to take on many of the functions of that old priestly aristocracy. They identified themselves as the bearers and the masters of particular forms of virtue, and developed discourses that positioned them as moral authorities, as people that, through hard work and self-discipline, had attained a kind of exemplary status that entitled them to tell other people what to do. And I think this is, we see this specifically, in terms of any of those kind of ideological occupations, lawyers and psychiatrists and so forth. Psychiatrists particularly. I think psychiatry is a fairly transparent form of secularized priestcraft, and people go to psychiatrists for many of the same reasons that in centuries past they would have gone to witch doctors. And I think they get a lot of the same things out of psychiatrists that more primitive folks might have gotten out of their shamans and so forth. So this priestly aristocracy is not a feature of, certainly not exclusively a feature of primitive culture. It's something that we still very much have with us. And I would argue that they really constitute a much larger segment of the population that they ever have before. We've got more priests, even though they don't call themselves that, than we've ever had to deal with. And anybody with a podcast is kind of... They've got one foot in the door of this strange discipline. But anyway, I guess that's all I wanted to say for this segment, other than to note, I still have the question lingering. He notes that on the one hand, there seems to be something, I don't want to say good, but he notes that this soil of this essentially dangerous form of human existence is what first prompts humankind to become something interesting. It deepens man's capability to be dishonest and evil and manipulative, and to turn himself into a kind of labyrinth, a problem that he himself must solve. And he doesn't seem to have any explanation for where this impulse comes from, other than this kind of the eternal soil of the priestly aristocracy. It's something that's just always been there. It's a disease that has never not existed. And he seems to suggest that the best thing to do is just leave it there, because the cure is worse than the disease. So we'll see where he goes with that from there.